Larry's prediction of where the market was going wasn't wrong. Hello and welcome to My Tiny Bottles, the project where I'm exploring my grandmother's legacy of miniature liquor bottles, one tiny bottle at a time. I'm your host, Tammy Coxon. Grandma's collection had a lot of Canadian whiskey, and my exploration of the genre continues with bottle 118, Silk Tassel from McGuinness Distilling. Before I talk about it in particular, I want to talk a little bit about the trajectory of Canadian whiskey that I'm starting to understand through this project. In my last episode, my guest Jared and I tasted 3 different Canadian whiskeys. One was the leftovers of bottle 82, Canadian Club, which I first tasted with my dad. That bottle was distilled in 1972 and bottled in 1978. It was pretty characteristic of 1970s Canadian whiskey. Very light and smooth, designed to appeal to the new generation of vodka and white rum drinkers. We compared it to a later release from the same brand, bottle 96, Canadian Club Classic. It was distilled in 1973, just a year later, but aged for 12 years instead of just 6. Released in 1985, it touted bigger, woodier flavoring in its advertising, and it was designed to appeal to an emerging upscale market of Scotch and bourbon drinkers who were just starting to appreciate bigger flavors. It was a little bolder, but still pretty light. The third bottle we tasted was a vintage bottle from Jared's parents. Packaged in a fabulous skyscraper-shaped bottle and a velvet bag, Carlton Tower was a premium Canadian whiskey from a much earlier time period. The tax strip lists 1946 as the distillation year, and the hang card stated that the youngest whiskey was 10 years and the oldest dated back to 1920s. So it was probably bottled in 1956. And it was completely different. Where the others were light and smooth, the Carlton Tower was lush and rich, almost sweet, much more full-bodied. Since I have that bottle, I've come back to it again and again because it really is a delight and so different than the bulk of the Canadian whiskey I've tasted from Grandma's collection. And different from the current crop of bolder, flavor-forward, modern brands of Canadian whiskey that have been getting some good press in recent years. I found one of those in Grandma's collection so far, an early version of Lot 40, a Canadian whiskey that has a lot more in common with American rye whiskey than many of the things called rye in Canada. In my episode about that bottle, I talked about how Canadian whiskey is made. Go read or watch that episode for the full details. But basically, Canadian whiskey has a lighter, more neutral base whiskey, and then one or more stronger flavoring whiskeys. These get blended together in different proportions or packaged separately to make different brands and bottlings. What that meant is that when that new generation of vodka and white rum drinkers emerged in the 1960s and 70s, Canadian whiskey was much better positioned to switch up what they were doing to appeal to them. The rules of American whiskey limited what U.S. distillers could do, and the blended whiskeys that they produced just weren't as good as the Canadian ones. The reason I'm bringing all this up in response to this tiny bottle of Silk Tassel is because the company behind it, McGuinness Distilling, was one of the first to recognize that this shift was happening and to respond to it. I talked about the history of McGuinness Distilling in bottle 64, Café Noir. In 1946, Larry McInness Jr. took over from his father in managing the company. And in 1968, he used one of just 4 spots allocated to his distillery by the LCBO to push a new, lighter style of whiskey, made by charcoal filtering an aged rye whiskey and then adding a bit of mature whiskey back to it for flavoring. Larry's prediction of where the market was going wasn't wrong, and soon all Canadian whiskey brands were shifting their production to lighter styles. The other thing that made me connect this bottle to my tasting of Carlton Tower with Jared is that McGuinness also created a Tower bottle. In honor of the construction of the CN Tower in Toronto in 1973, they released an amazing CN Tower-shaped bottle. And that wasn't their only foray into a novelty look. They also had a captain's table bottling that was in what looked like an I Dream of Jeannie-inspired decanter. Now, if the bottles I've tasted are representative, there was a lot of mediocre, mostly the same Canadian whiskey in the 70s and 80s, so I guess you had to distinguish yourself somehow. I expect that Silk Tassel will be another one of those mostly the same Canadian whiskeys. It's hard to track down its origins, but McGuinness started producing a whiskey called Gold Tassel at some point in the 1960s. Although, strangely enough, the only newspaper mention I can find of it is in a 1965 Hungarian-language Ontario newspaper. In the 1970s, they either shifted to or added the Silk Tassel line. It's unclear whether the two overlapped or not. Silk Tassel was launched as a 5-year whiskey, and advertising played up the benefits and smoothness coming from an extra 2 years of aging over the minimum. Then, in 1983, they released a new and improved 6-year-old Silk Tassel to much fanfare. My tiny bottle, though, is 8 years old. It looks just like the tiny bottles of 6-year-old Silk Tassel, with only the number in the circle at the top of the label being different. I have never been able to find a picture of a full-size 8-year-old bottle or any mention of it in advertising, so I can't say for sure when it would have been released. But I do know that the McGuinness brand was purchased by Corby Spirits and Wine in 1987, and by 1988, they had begun closing down some of the locations that are listed on my Tiny Bottles label. So I would guess this bottle is 1984 to 1988. Given what I've experienced of similar era Canadian whiskeys, I'm honestly not expecting a lot when I taste this one. But since I have so many Canadian whiskeys to choose from, it'll be interesting to put it in another multi-bottle comparison and see how it stands up. Be sure to subscribe so you'll catch that when it happens. Leave a comment while you're at it, or like and share this episode. You can also do those things on social media. I'm at My Tiny Bottles on Instagram and Facebook, and at TammyLC on Blue Sky. And of course, you can head to my website, mytinybottles.com, for more about this bottle and all the bottles. Cheers!